One of the most famous Spider-Man comic book artists of all time is weighing in on the MCU Sony debacle regarding Spider-Man, and the most interesting thing about this isn't his take on Spider-Man, but rather his opinion that indie comics are the future of comic books, and that's something we've been talking about on this channel for quite some time. It's being proven time and time again that mainstream superhero comics are not where it's at for most creators these days, but indie is wide open. So before we get into the video, please subscribe to Clownfish TV for more pop culture news, views, and rants. We hit 57,000 subs, 57,000 of you. Thank you so much for the support. All right, comic book resources. Todd McFarlane has choice words about MCU Sony split. Okay, and what's interesting is they have the headline about the Spider-Man situation, but really what piqued our interest was Todd's comments on the state of the comic book industry right now. Now, Todd McFarlane, if you're a youngin' and you don't know who Todd McFarlane was, he was one of the biggest artists of the 90s. He still is a big deal. He has McFarlane Productions. He's back in the news now because his indie book Spawn has just hit its 300th issue. He's been doing it for a very long time. He was one of the founding fathers of Image Comics. He was very much a punk creator, I think. He came from a different era when comic book creators took chances. I would lump McFarlane in with guys like Frank Miller, Dave Sim, that they were sort of like punk comic creators. They were breaking down boundaries, trying new things, thumbing their noses at the man, and being successful despite the odds being stacked against them, showing people how to do things rather than just following a trend. And I look at a lot of what's going on with independent comics right now with all the crowdfunding and the kind of the resurgence of manga and digital comics, and I'm thinking that we're kind of looking at another pendulum swing, that we're going to swing back into this era again, into the era of like the early Image guys. That's what it kind of feels like. These guys, really had a business sense and a kind of a disregard, healthy disregard for corporate comics culture. And Todd McFarlane still has that. He still has that fire, which is good. So Todd McFarlane attended Fan Expo Toronto this year, appearing at a signing event, a photo op, and most importantly, leading two talks on Saturday the 24th and 25th. In the first panel, McFarlane spoke about his decision to become a comic book artist, the origin story of his publishing house, Image Comics, and the people that accompanied him on his 3-decade trip. It was a snapshot of an era that no longer exists, when Marvel and DC were first and foremost comic book publishers. The artwork was drawn by hand, and artists like McFarlane still had some freedom to change the design of iconic superheroes through sheer stubbornness and blatant disregard for the status quo. Now, if, this is me talking, not the author of the article, now if you have a disregard for the status quo, or you call out the shenanigans going on at corporate comics, you're demonized by creators working for those publications and by the press that support them, and by Twitter. Now, those things didn't exist back then. I can only imagine what would have happened to Todd McFarlane, Rob Liefeld, Jim Lee, had the Image split happen now. What Twitter would have said, what outlets like Comic Book Resources and Newsarama and Bleeding Cool, especially what they would have said about their decision to basically thumb their noses at the comic book industry and call out shenanigans in the comic book industry, which is what these guys did. And the weird thing about Image is Image kind of started out sticking it to the man, and from where I'm sitting right now, Image as a publisher, as a company, has very much become the man, and some of the people still working there have become the man, whereas Todd McFarlane seems like he still has that rebellious streak in him, which is good, which is why we're still listening to Todd McFarlane 25-30 years later, because he hasn't lost his fire. Some of his peers have become jokes, since then, though. So the second talk was a completely different beast. In it, McFarlane spoke about the state of the comic book industry today, where most of the comic book market share is controlled by the new owners of Marvel and DC, Disney and Warner Brothers, who he noted spent tens of billions of dollars acquiring the exclusive rights to every superhero character under the sun. According to McFarlane, this wasn't always done in the smartest possible way. That is true. According to McFarlane, who went over the ins and outs of the Sony MCU split, it was the avoidance of another bidding war like the one Disney and Fox recently underwent that prompted the Sony MCU separation over Spider-Man. You saw what happened with Spider-Man, he asked the crowd. They were trying to extract Spider-Man, right? And Sony went, no, it ain't gonna happen. According to McFarlane, this move might be the smartest thing that Sony could have done for Peter Parker. For the co-founder of Image Comics, this is the best time that has ever existed. This is interesting. For the co-founder of Image Comics, this is the best time that ever existed to start a career as an independent comic book author, as counterintuitive as that might seem in a world where most of the best-selling comic books are either Marvel or DC. He described how the race to acquire the next top property has become so heated that producers are preemptively buying the rights to film comic books that have not even been written yet. I think that's part of the problem. I'm gonna be honest. I think that's part of the problem is, to some degree, comic books are basically pitches for Hollywood, shows and movies, and not actually comic books. So you don't really have to make a good comic book. You just have to have a good idea, get it on paper, and then Hollywood takes it from there. But that's a whole nother issue. The solicitation process for these books is based on a cover, 3 lines that summarize the plot and a price. According to him, 90% of the time, the producers doing the buying have not read the issue. Once it hits the stands, other people in Hollywood will notice it and it will be too late. So this is what he said. This is what McFarlane said. If you're Netflix, Hulu, Amazon, HBO, you're looking at these movies called Avengers that are making all this money, and you want comic book stuff. They have to take a Sharpie, they have to black out those top 94 properties, because if they're not Disney or Warner Brothers, they're just not getting it. McFarlane finished his second talk with a few optimistic words about the future of the industry. Comic books are never going away. It's just a medium of words and pictures. That combo will never go away. What may change is the delivery mechanism. The scale, the size, the format, but there will forever be people making drawings and putting words to those drawings. Tapes, CDs, DVDs, stream, still music's still going to be there, comics are still going to be there. However, the way we end up bringing them into our houses, that may change. That's just progress. That's the change I'm talking about, and he must know what he's talking about because he hit issue 300 of Spawn. So it's tying with Dave Sims' Cerebus. The Aardvark is the longest running creator-owned comic series in the world. Yeah, there's a lot to unpack here. Because he is right about Hollywood. I mean, Hollywood, you have studios that are not Disney and Warner Brothers looking to buy comic book properties, but Disney and Warner Brothers have the biggest comic book properties locked down. Now, the flip side of that is, can you realistically compete with the DCEU and the MCU with an independent comic book character? I think some characters could. I think some characters could. I think if the MCU takes a nosedive, the way a lot of people think it's going to take a nosedive, that might level the playing field a little bit. But I think this is why Hollywood is going to manga. I think this is a big reason why Hollywood is looking at manga and anime right now. Because if they can't scoop up American properties right now, the next best thing is go scoop up Japanese properties. And when manga is really, really knocking it out of the park as the American comic book industry declines, when My Hero Academia, when those characters are becoming the superheroes that kids today are growing up with, yeah, it would be a smart move to start making My Hero Academia movies, which would probably be terrible, but hopefully not. I mean, we saw with Alita that you actually can make a good adaptation of manga and anime. If done right, if you have somebody in charge who actually respects the source material. So hopefully we'll see more solid movies based on anime and manga. But I think that's why Hollywood right now, why there's so much going on in anime and manga, because that's sort of the next battlefield. And again, that might come down to just the availability of superheroes. And the public eventually is going to tire of superheroes. It's going to be like how every other movie was a Western back in the 50s and 60s. Now nobody really cares. You very rarely see a Western. I think that is going to happen to superheroes eventually. I don't know when, but eventually people are going to get burnt out. They're like, oh my God, not another superhero movie. But he's right. The future right now is in independent comics. If you want to make comic books right now, getting a job at Marvel and DC And one I would strongly advise against it, because those companies, as they are right now, will probably not exist for much longer. A lot of this stuff is probably going to be outsourced. But if you actually want to have a future in comic books and making comics and creating stuff, you're going to have to do your own thing, because that is where the future is. And I know a lot of other YouTubers are saying that. It's become very, very obvious just in publishing comics, not even talking Hollywood. Just in publishing comics, it is much more lucrative to come up with your own ideas, build an audience online, and then crowdfund books yourselves than it is to go work for Marvel and DC. The page rates are dropping. The sales are dropping. You have other publishers like IDW that are just hanging on by their fingertips. It's not a very safe place to be. As an artist, it's not a safe place to be. You are better off if you can do a 100,000 plus crowdfunding campaign and do that, once a year or whatever. You're better off doing it that way than you are to put all your eggs into a basket with a broken handle. So I agree with Todd McFarlane. This is a really good insight. And again, this is a guy who's actually done it. He's not talking out of his ass. Todd McFarlane went from being the biggest Marvel artist, or one of the biggest Marvel artists. I would say it was between McFarlane, Lee, and Liefeld back in the early 90s. He left at the peak of his career to go do his own thing, and a lot of people threw shade at him. I remember people throwing shade at him, and really what prompted it was I remember reading an interview in Wizard Magazine. Remember Wizard Magazine? I think it was Wizard Magazine, yeah. I remember reading an interview in Wizard, I believe, where McFarlane said he got kind of salty because he would go to the grocery store and he would see his Spider-Man art on a can of SpaghettiOs, and at first he thought that was pretty cool, that his Spider-Man, his version of Spider-Man, was on a can of SpaghettiOs. And then as a businessman, he'd be like, why am I not getting paid a nickel every time somebody buys a can of SpaghettiOs? Now, I haven't seen any Spawn SpaghettiOs, but now McFarlane's in charge of his own thing, and he's doing well. There supposedly is another Spawn movie coming. Spawn had a fairly popular, if I remember correctly, adult animated series on HBO. I went to the theater to go see the original Spawn movie, which admittedly wasn't that great, but it was ahead of its time when it came out. So you can get these things done without working for Marvel or DC. And this is the future. Again, if you just want to make comic books, this is the future. You have to do your own thing. Take it from people who have done it in the past. Take it from people who are currently doing it right now. We're seeing a whole nother generation of YouTubers turned comic book artists, or comic book artists turned YouTubers turned comic book artists. It's absolutely 100% possible, and that is the future. That is the future. So don't even waste your time. If you're a young creator, don't even waste your time trying to get a job for a publisher that could go out of business tomorrow. Just do your own thing. Thinking about printing your own comic books, graphic novel, or manga? We recommend our friends over at Print Ninja. We've been using Print Ninja as long as they've been printing comics, and both the quality and price is excellent. Mention Clownfish TV and get an additional 5% overrun of your book order quantity printed for free. For free! That's free books, people. Just mention this offer on the phone or in the additional information box on the quote request form. That's printninja.com, or click on the link in the description below. Hey guys, thanks for watching Clownfish TV. Please consider supporting the channel. Go to clownfishsupport.com. That's clownfishsupport.com. And if you want to join our community, go to clownfishtalk.com. That's clownfishtalk.com. Please subscribe, ring the bell for notifications. We will talk to you next time.